On August 9th, 1988, the greatest hockey player to ever live was traded not because he failed, but because the game he dominated had become bigger than the franchise that owned him. When Wayne Gretzky packed his bags for Los Angeles, it shattered the sacred illusion of loyalty in professional sports. Up until that quiet summer afternoon, fans believed that generational icons were untouchable. If Edmonton could trade the Great One after winning 4 Stanley Cups in 5 years, then no player, no legacy, and no tradition was ever safe again. But Gretzky was only the first domino. Over the next decade, a series of desperate telephone calls, bruised egos, and bitter rivalries would reshape the National Hockey League forever. Blockbuster trades in hockey are rarely just about swapping names on a roster. They are chaotic economic gambles that strip cities of their identity and accidentally hand their fiercest rivals a decade of championship glory. And to understand how modern hockey was born, you have to look at the moments when general managers pulled the trigger on deals that everyone said were impossible. To comprehend the sheer magnitude of the Gretzky trade, you have to rewind to the late 1980s. The Edmonton Oilers were not just a hockey team. They were an unstoppable dynasty, a high-octane scoring machine that ran the league with unmatched arrogance and grace. Wayne Gretzky was the undisputed heart of that machine, shattering records that people thought would stand for a century. But behind the scenes, owner Peter Pocklington was bleeding cash in his outside business ventures. He looked at the most valuable asset in North American sports and saw a financial lifeline. Across the continent, Bruce McNall, the flashy new owner of the Los Angeles Kings, was desperate to turn a sun-drenched non-hockey market into a Hollywood attraction. The secret negotiations were cold and transactional. Hundreds of phone calls, millions of dollars in cash and draft picks were dangled to seal the deal. When the announcement finally hit the news, fans across Canada reacted with genuine grief and outrage. Members of Parliament even demanded the government block the trade to keep a national treasure on home soil. But the ink was already dry, and the economic landscape of professional hockey was about to be forcibly shifted thousands of miles south. What seemed like a national tragedy for Canada quickly became the single most lucrative expansion catalyst in league history. Before 1988, the idea of professional hockey thriving in the American Sunbelt was considered a fever dream. Los Angeles was a secondary sports market where hockey tickets were practically given away. But the arrival of Gretzky transformed the Great Western Forum into the hottest ticket in Hollywood. Celebrities lined up at glass level, merchandise sales exploded, and overnight, hockey became cool in Southern California. The league office in New York took immediate notice. Seeing the massive television ratings and commercial success in Los Angeles, the National Hockey League aggressively pushed its boundaries. Within a few short years, franchises sprouted in Anaheim, San Jose, Tampa Bay, Miami, and Dallas. Without Gretzky wearing a Kings jersey, the modern television deals and the global expansion of the sport simply would not exist. Yet, while the league was busy celebrating this new era of prosperity, another storm was brewing up north in the province of Quebec. And this time, the crisis would not be triggered by an owner selling a superstar, but by a teenage phenom who refused to play altogether. In 1991, Eric Lindros was billed as the next one, a physical powerhouse with hands of gold who was destined to revolutionize the sport. The Quebec Nordiques held the first overall pick in the draft and were desperate to rebuild their struggling franchise around him. But Lindros and his family did something unprecedented in modern hockey history. He publicly declared that he would never put on a Nordique sweater, citing concerns over the team's ownership, market size, and commercial future. When Quebec selected him anyway, Lindros held up the jersey for photos with a tight smile, but refused to wear it over his shoulders. He walked away from millions, returning to junior hockey for an entire season just to prove he was not bluffing. The standoff humiliated the organization and outraged local fans who saw his refusal as a direct insult to French-Canadian culture. For a full year, the Nordiques were held hostage by an 18-year-old kid. Pressure mounted on general manager Marcel Aubout to end the circus. He knew he had to trade the most hyped prospect of a generation, but he also knew that if he played his cards right, he could demand a ransom so absurd it would change his franchise forever. By the summer of 1992, the bidding war for Eric Lindros had devolved into absolute chaos. Two teams claimed they had legitimate deals in place, the Philadelphia Flyers and the New York Rangers. The situation got so messy that the league had to hire an independent arbitrator just to determine who actually owned the rights to the player. In the end, Philadelphia won the ruling, but the price they agreed to pay was staggering. To get their generational power forward, the Flyers gave up star center Mike Ricci, elite defenseman, multiple first-round draft picks, $15 million in cash, and a young Swedish prospect named Peter Forsberg. At the time, Philadelphia felt victorious, believing they had secured the cornerstone of their franchise for the next 15 years. Lindros would indeed become a dominant force in Pennsylvania, winning an Hart Trophy and striking fear into opponents. But the underlying mechanics of that trade created an incredible historical paradox. Philadelphia got their isolated superstar, but Quebec walked away with an entire championship infrastructure tucked neatly into a single transaction. While Eric Lindros was absorbing the brutal physical punishment of the Eastern Conference, the pieces Quebec received in return were quietly coming together. But the story took a heartbreaking political turn before the rewards could be reaped on the ice. The Nordiques were financially suffocating in a small market, unable to secure public funding for a new arena. In 1995, the franchise was sold and relocated to Denver, becoming the Colorado Avalanche. The newly moved team inherited a gold mine. Peter Forsberg blossomed into one of the most complete and dominant centers the league had ever witnessed. Mike Ricci anchored the middle lines with grit, while the accumulated draft assets allowed Colorado to build a deep, terrifying roster overnight. The very players traded away for a single superstar had transformed an insolvent franchise into a juggernaut. Colorado was already a contender in their very first season in Denver, but they were still missing one final crucial element to win a championship. They needed an elite, ruthless game-changer in net, and by a bizarre twist of fate, the most legendary Canadian franchise was about to hand them exactly that on a silver platter. On December 2nd, 1995, the Montreal Canadiens were hosting the Detroit Red Wings at the iconic Forum. Montreal was not just any hockey team. They were the most decorated, proud franchise in the history of the sport, built on strict culture and historical reverence. Their starter that night was Patrick Roy, a two-time Stanley Cup winner and a living legend in Quebec who single-handedly carried the team to championships with his revolutionary butterfly style. But tension had been boiling between Roy and his rookie head coach, Mario Tremblay. Tremblay wanted to assert authority, while Roy felt disrespected by the coach's rigid tactical demands. That night, Detroit mercilessly tore Montreal apart. Goal after goal flew past Roy, but Tremblay refused to pull his superstar, leaving him in net for humiliating punishment. By the time 9 goals had crossed the line, the home crowd began mockingly cheering every routine save. When Tremblay finally pulled him in the middle of the second period, the damage was irreversible. Roy walked past his coach, stepped up to team president Ronald Corey sitting behind the bench, and uttered 5 words that sent shockwaves through the hockey world. "I have played my last game in Montreal." By publicly declaring his ultimatum behind the bench, Patrick Roy completely destroyed any leverage Montreal had in the trade market. Every general manager in North America knew the Canadiens were backed into a corner and forced to move the best big-game goaltender on earth. Panic set in within the Montreal front office. Desperate to suppress the toxic narrative and salvage control, management rushed into a disastrous deal just 4 days later. They traded Patrick Roy and Captain Mike Keane to the Colorado Avalanche in exchange for Jocelyn Thibault, Martin Rukinski, and Andrei Kovalenko. On paper, Montreal received decent assets, but in reality, they traded away a generational icon and irreplaceable winning culture for pennies on the dollar. Canadian sports media shredded the decision, but the deal was finalized. For Montreal, it marked the tragic beginning of a dark, decades-long era of playoff mediocrity. For Colorado, it was the exact missing piece to complete a super team. The trade did not just settle a personal feud between a player and a coach. It ignited a brutal, blood-filled rivalry that would dominate hockey for the rest of the decade. When Patrick Roy landed in Denver, the Avalanche instantly transformed into an unstoppable force. Just 6 months after the trade, Roy raised the Stanley Cup in 1996, delivering Colorado a championship in their inaugural season. But the true legacy of that trade went far beyond a single parade. Roy brought an intense, combative edge to Denver that clashed head-on with the reigning powerhouse of the era, the Detroit Red Wings. What followed was the most violent, high-stakes rivalry in modern sports history. For 5 consecutive years, the path to the championship went through either Denver or Detroit. Games devolved into benches-clearing brawls, blood spilled across the ice, and goalies charged down the rink to fight at center ice. Ironically, the night Roy was humiliated by Detroit in a Montreal sweater was the very catalyst that created their worst nightmare. Behind the scenes, the Lindros trade assets and the Roy acquisition had coalesced into a roster that shared 2 Stanley Cups and dominated the Western Conference for a generation. A single emotional blow-up in Canada had inadvertently built a Western empire, leaving the rest of the league desperately searching for ways to keep up. When you trace the line connecting these 3 legendary transactions, an uncanny pattern begins to emerge. None of these monumental trades were born out of patient, balanced strategy. They were all ignited by extreme human emotions, financial desperation, raw hubris, and personal grudges. Edmonton surrendered the greatest player of all time because an owner was short on cash. Quebec was forced into a complex megatrade because a 19-year-old prospect refused to bow to tradition. Montreal gave away the greatest goaltender of a generation because a prideful coach refused to pull him from a meaningless game. Yet the ripple effects reshaped the entire business model of North American sports. Gretzky single-handedly built the blueprint for modern league expansion into Sunbelt markets. The Lindros package proved that a deep collection of elite young assets will almost always beat relying on a single savior. And the Patrick Roy trade demonstrated how quickly a mismanaged conflict can destroy an original 6 franchise while gifting an opponent a decade of dominance. In professional sports, management often likes to preach absolute control, but history shows that the biggest tectonic shifts are almost always accidental. Decades later, the ghosts of these blockbusters still echo through the halls of every front office in the National Hockey League. Whenever a general manager picks up the phone today, they are operating in a world carved out by the fallout of Gretzky, Lindros, and Roy. Modern contracts feature complex no-trade clauses, hyper-calculated salary cap gymnastics, and PR teams dedicated to managing player egos, all designed specifically to prevent these chaotic explosions from ever happening again. But as long as human emotions, pride, and greed drive the men behind the desks, absolute control will remain an illusion. Somewhere in the league right now, a quiet phone call is being made, a contract is being signed, or a relationship is silently fracturing behind closed doors. And just like that August afternoon in 1988, the hockey world will once again be caught off guard, watching the dominoes fall, and remembering that in the high-stakes theater of the National Hockey League, history is written not on the ice, but at the trading table.